2 Samuel chapter 11 is perhaps one of the most famous scenes from David's life, but not a pretty scene. It happened in the spring of the year, at the time when kings go out to battle, that David sent Joab and his servants with him and all Israel, and they destroyed the people of Ammon and besieged Rabbah. But David remained at Jerusalem. Then it happened one evening that David arose from his bed and walked on the roof of the king's house. And from the roof he saw a woman bathing, and the woman was very beautiful to behold. So David sent and inquired about the woman, and someone said, "Is this not Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite?" Then David sent messengers and took her, and she came to him, and he lay with her. For she was cleansed from her impurity, and she returned to her house. And the woman conceived, so she sent and told David and said, "I am with child." Then David sent to Joab, saying, "Send me Uriah the Hittite." And Joab sent Uriah to David. When Uriah had come to him, David asked how Joab was doing, and how the people were doing, and how the war prospered. And David said to Uriah, "Go down to your house and wash your feet." So Uriah departed from the king's house, and a gift of food from the king followed him. But Uriah slept at the door of the king's house with all the servants of his lord, and did not go down to his house. So when they told David, saying, "Uriah did not go down to his house," David said to Uriah, "Did you not come from a journey? Why did you not go down to your house?" And Uriah said to David, "The ark and Israel and Judah are dwelling in tents. And my lord Joab and the servants of my lord are encamped in the open fields. Shall I then go to my house to eat and drink and to lie with my wife? As you live and as your soul lives, I will not do this thing." Then David said to Uriah, "Wait here today also, and tomorrow I will let you depart." So Uriah remained in Jerusalem that day and the next. Now when David called him, he ate and drank before him, and he made him drunk. And at evening he went out to lie on his bed with the servants of his lord, but he did not go down to his house. In the morning it happened that David wrote a letter to Joab and sent it by the hand of Uriah. And he wrote in the letter, saying, quote, "Set Uriah in the forefront of the hottest battle, and retreat from him that he may be struck down and die." So it was, while Joab besieged the city, that he assigned Uriah to a place where he knew there were valiant men. Then the men of the city came out and fought with Joab, and some of the people of the servants of David fell, and Uriah the Hittite died also. Then Joab sent and told David all the things concerning the war. Moving ahead to verses 24. The archers shot from the wall at your servants, and some of the king's servants are dead, and your servant Uriah the Hittite is dead also. Then David said to the messenger, "Thus shall you say to Joab, do not let this thing displease you, for the sword devours one as well as the other. Strengthen your attack against the city and overthrow it." So encourage him. When the wife of Uriah heard that Uriah her husband was dead, she mourned for her husband. And when her mourning was over, David sent and brought her to his house, and she became his wife and bore him a son. But the thing that David had done displeased the Lord. Most everyone knows that our English names for the 12 months of the year have Latin roots. But who among us ever associates the month of March with war? Yet that's the origin every time you write the date this month. The month of Martius, March, was named after Mars, the Roman god. In fact, important festivals and ceremonies connected to military campaigns were traditionally held all during this month in the honor of Mars. Of course, the Jewish calendar, you understand, had its own names for each of the months of the year, but there is a poetic parallel and an irony that comes out in this David-Bathsheba episode, because ironically, the setting for this sad chapter is in the spring of the year. And it involved a war of the worst kind, a war between the flesh and the spirit, and sadly, the flesh won. Springtime marks the end of the rainy season, you see, in the Middle East, and at this time, two major things take place which aid the resumption of military campaigns in ancient Bible times. First, the roads are once again dry and favorable for the movement of troops and supply wagons and chariots. So it's a good time to be on the move, on the road. Secondly, wheat and barley harvests are ready, and they are a critical food source for an army on the march. The troops were able to raid standing fields for food, since there were no McDonald's back then, no Pizza Huts. In fact, the previous chapter is all about a successful military campaign led by King David against the Ammonites. Chapter 11 picks up where chapter 10 left off, summoning every able-bodied male of Israel to come and prepare for war, continuing war with the Ammonites under the distinguished General Joab. I say every able-bodied male, except for King David himself. David remained in Jerusalem at the palace, you see. But this was not his usual practice. Being out in front, leading the troops into battle, was the expected practice of a Near Eastern ruler. And this singular departure from the norm had serious moral and spiritual collateral consequences. It gave opportunity for one unguarded hour in David's life, which in turn resulted in temptation, which in turn resulted in sin, which in turn resulted in the judgment of God both on David and David's household for years to come. Now, before we go any further, we need to pause and make a few observations about this familiar narrative from David's life. And the first thing we need to say is that whatever things were written in the Bible were written under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit by their human authors, and they were inspired to record and write down what they were given for a reason. And Romans 15:14 says, "For everything that was written in the past was written to teach us." So it's instructive material. It's not just for entertainment. And it says, so that we, through endurance taught in the Scriptures and the encouragement they provide, might have hope. So this account of David's lapse into sin is not for our entertainment. It's not something to appeal to prurient interest. It is meant to teach us, to warn us, to encourage us. The second thing we need to know is that the space given to this incident helps to prove the integrity of the Bible as a whole. Had the Bible been just a collection of myths about idealized men and women, it would not have recorded something so damaging as David's lapse into sin. It might have stopped after he killed Goliath, and we would say, oh yes, he was a hero, he was terrific. It ends on a positive note. That would have maintained the image of a mythical hero. But David wasn't a mythical figure. He was a real flesh and blood person. So in spite of the ridicule and accusations from atheists and agnostics about the truthfulness of the Bible, we see the authentic, unvarnished truth about men and women descended from Adam. We see them with all their warts. What exactly do we learn? Namely this: there is none righteous, no, not one. All have sinned. All have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. All are sinners who need the grace of God. Thirdly, this is an account not of the average worldling, keep in mind. It's not of the average unbeliever. It's how a devout child of God fell into serious sin. In that regard, it's a warning to all of us that evil is more seductive than we can handle on our own, that Satan is more clever than we could ever anticipate. In the words of Peter, stay alert, watch out for your great enemy, the devil. He prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour. And you or I could very well be his next meal. if we're not careful. Also, let's be warned of pride by the words of Paul to the Corinthians. He says, so if you think you're standing firm, be careful that you don't fall. There is never a point that we reach in our Christian experience that we can somehow assume spiritual invulnerability. We're never invincible. We're always susceptible. We can always succumb to this same sort of thing. Fourthly, this passage is not adequately dealt with, nor is it interpreted correctly if, after looking at it, the minister or the people listening to the sermon simply conclude, shame, shame on David. He wasn't a very nice Christian. And then walk away. Let's be very clear. David was no hypocrite. For many years, he endured unfair hostility. He endured persecution. He endured death threats from his predecessor Saul. And yet all the while, he maintained the highest personal, moral, and ethical and spiritual standards found anywhere in the Bible. He exercised remarkable degrees of faith and self-restraint, submission, humility, patience, and meekness, perhaps more than any other servant of God mentioned in the Bible. Now, after much endurance, God had brought his troubles to a close, and he had become one of the most powerful monarchs in that quarter of the world. What happened to David can happen to any one of us. And indeed, some of us may have had similar brushes with this temptation, with this sin. For others, don't congratulate yourself. Don't pat yourself on the back. The dangerous intersection may be just ahead, a few more miles down the road of life. In any case, when we propose to scrutinize the sin of another person in the Bible, it behooves us to tread softly and to remember the words of John Bradford when he saw a criminal back in the 1500s being led out by the executioners. John Bradford said, "There but for the grace of God goes John Bradford." In other words, Bradford knew that the same evil tendencies, the same evil principles, the same Adamic nature were in his own heart that had brought that criminal to his shameful end. Now, having said all that, the Bible never encourages us to do the opposite. It never encourages us to go soft on sin itself. To be sure, there's something quite remarkable in the fearless way in which the writer of this book unveils the guilt of David. It is set before us in all of its enormity without any attempt to excuse or disguise it as less serious than it was. Surprisingly, the only statement really appearing in the whole long narrative to characterize the king's behavior and God's response was the very last verse. But the thing David had done displeased the Lord. What then was it exactly that displeased the Lord beside the obvious? I mean, you say, we don't need anything more than that. He broke the seventh, and then he broke the sixth commandments, respectively. Thou shalt not commit adultery, thou shalt not murder. You don't need to say any more than that. Well, in this David-Bathsheba incident, we see how David allowed himself to be drawn deeper and deeper into sin in a number of insidious ways. But the main thing that we need to understand is that there was one unguarded hour in David's life. And that is behind this chapter, and that is behind many a fall. In fact, every fall of a believer. What are these insidious ways that David allowed himself to be drawn deeper and deeper into sin? Well, to begin with, David abandoned his purpose and calling as the king of Israel. He stayed home when he should have been out on the battlefield. He should have been with his troops. He should have been marching against Ammon. He should have been there. Instead, he was at home, indulgent, in the palace. As we saw earlier in this series, David's primary mission as the king was to rid Israel of all of its enemies so that the future king could build the Lord's house, could build the temple under peacetime conditions. See, whenever we neglect our responsibilities, whether it's at home, whether it's in the church, whether it's at work, we place ourselves in the path of trouble. We place ourselves in a position of being a pawn of the devil. Mark it down. Mark it down. Now, during the course of any given week, as you know, I have to visit on the road quite a bit, and my vehicles take a beating, but this week really was another milestone in that regard. I sometimes have to visit several post offices for church and personal business during the week, and on one of those occasions last week, to no surprise, I couldn't get near the Moon post office because of the waiting line. It was simply too long. And since I didn't have my oil, I couldn't do an oil change in the parking lot in the meantime. So I thought, no problem. I was headed to Beaver Hospital. I would make my hospital rounds, and then before leaving the city of Beaver, the town of Beaver, I would stop at the local post office. Now, it had been a very windy afternoon on Thursday, and never thought of anything bad happening, but I parked my vehicle in the much more convenient parking in front of the Beaver post office. And there was diagonal parking. And I went in, and I was briefly taking care of business there when another person came in and said, "Does anyone here own a black pickup truck?" And I thought to myself, oh, now, what? I turned around from the post office counter, and I looked at the woman, and I said, "Yes." She said, "Well, I just watched." And she said, as some large branches over your truck fell from the tree and smashed all over it. Sure enough, I went out to find my truck looking as if someone was intent on building a brush pile around it or on it. Furthermore, one branch was just hanging there, just dangling, and and it would have blown down and finished off the mirrors. Now, please understand, I wasn't in the post office buying lottery tickets. I wasn't there purchasing something for my personal stamp collection, which I never had. I was on legitimate business, mailing my income taxes, but I was unfamiliar, you see, with the park and the post office. I was unfamiliar with the trees around the post office and the hazard they represented. What's more, having already had a series of freak vehicle mishaps over the last 6 months, you can understand why when I got home and related the story to Oksana, she replied something to the effect, "That's 3 strikes, you better stay at home from now on." Nevertheless, you get the point I'm trying to make about being in the wrong place at the wrong time, because David was in the wrong place at the wrong time, and because of that, he focused on the wrong sites. Bathsheba taking a bath. A second thing that David did, which drew him deeper and deeper into sin, was that when temptation came, David looked into it rather than away. He concentrated on it. And the steps down were very predictable. David saw Bathsheba. David's lust was stirred. David inquired about Bathsheba. David then sent messengers to get Bathsheba. Bathsheba came, and David slept with her. Now, had David paused on the palace roof for just a moment when all of this happened, had he turned his head and he offered up a brief prayer saying, "Lord, help me," or had he passed on to other official royal duties within the palace at that time? In other words, had he changed the channel, he might have escaped the tempter's power. Paul told Timothy, "Flee the evil desires of youth and pursue righteousness, faith, love, and peace, along with those who call on the Lord out of a pure heart." It's not enough to turn from sin without turning to something positive. You see, that was the illustration Jesus gave when he said that there was a householder, and the house was filled with demons, and the householder came along and swept the house and cleaned it and dusted it and drove out all the demons, but the house was empty. And then the 7 demons went out, and they got 7 more, and they came back, and now the final condition of that house was even worse. That's what happens when you try to clean up the inside without putting something inside, namely Jesus. So to flee temptation doesn't just happen, it demands a pre-planned strategy. What's the pre-planned strategy? Well, maybe A, ask God to help you stay clear of the people, the places, and the situations that tempt you. You say, well, I'm not sure anybody can do that. If you're driving down the road and you see a billboard, and the billboard evokes imaginations or thoughts, what can you do about it? Well, that's where something else comes in. B, memorize and meditate specific passages of the Bible to help you combat your weakness. Remember the patriarch Job. He said, I've made a covenant with my eyes. Why then should I look upon a maid with lust? I've made a covenant with my eyes. That's a good policy. C, find another believer with whom you can confide in and tell them about your struggles. If necessary, call that person up on the phone when temptation strikes and ask them to pray for you. And D, as Charles Spurgeon used to say, learn to say no. It'll be of more use to you than learning to read Latin. Now, David entertained the temptation by inquiring about Bathsheba, and now not even the knowledge that she was a married woman could stop the momentum of his desires. So let's ask some questions. What settings do you typically find yourself in when tempted? Then avoid them. What props do you have that support your sin? Eliminate them. What people are you usually with when you fall into temptation? Avoid them. There are two equally damning lies that Satan wants us to believe. One is, just one time won't hurt. It will hurt. The second is, now that you've messed up and ruined your life and you're beyond God's use, you might as well go on and keep enjoying your sin. God's done with you. Lies. 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 All from the father of lies. In truth, God says something quite different. He says the law was brought in so that the trespass might increase. The law is you drive 45 miles an hour here. Oh, I went over. I went 50. I broke the law. My conscience is telling me something. But then it goes on to say, where sin increased, grace increased all the more. The greater the force of the temptation, the greater God measures out grace. The greater the failure, the more willing God is to demonstrate the grace of his forgiveness. The Apostle Paul's life was an example. He had persecuted the church of God. He had shown his contempt for Jesus. But he said, God had mercy on me because he knew I was acting in ignorance. Either way, the situation is not hopeless. Satan just wants us to believe that it is. So beside abandoning his purpose as king by staying home, beside looking into the temptation instead of away from it, there's a third thing which David did, which led him deeper into sin, and that was, instead of confessing his sin, he scrambled to hide it. We know this. David could have chosen to stop and turn from evil at any stage along the way, but you see, that's not how sin works. Once you start in it, it gets difficult to stop. So he tried to cover up the sin by adding further deception. In order to cover up lust, he sent for Bathsheba. In order to cover up adultery, he sent for Uriah to come home and sleep with his wife. When that plan failed because of Uriah's sense of loyalty and patriotism, David sent for Joab and had Uriah murdered under the guise of a failed military maneuver. Now, for many, many years, I've known a Russian parable that I think is extremely practical. And the Russian parable goes like this. There was a hunter, the hunter was out in the woods, he raised his rifle and he took careful aim at a huge bear. When about to pull the trigger, the bear spoke in a soft, soothing voice. Wait a minute. Isn't it better for us to talk than for you to shoot? What do you want? Let's negotiate the matter, said the bear. And lowering his rifle, the hunter replied, well, I want a fur coat. Good, said the bear. All I want is a full stomach. So let's compromise. They sat down to negotiate, and after a time, the bear walked away alone. The negotiations had been successful. The bear had a full stomach. The hunter had his fur coat. Okay, I'll give you a few moments because obviously that's not sinking in. But anyway, the bear swallowed the man and he now had his fur coat. Compromising with sin never gets positive results. David put both Bathsheba and Uriah in the proverbial rock and a hard place position. Neither of them knew what David was trying to do, but both of them became unwitting accomplices to his sin. You see, the more we try to cover up sin, the worse it gets. And that is precisely why the Bible says in Proverbs 28, whoever conceals their sins will not prosper, but the one who confesses them and renounces them will find mercy. David, the man who wrote some of the most deeply moving, convicting, and convincing passages in all of the Bible. The beautiful book of Psalms. The man who started out as a humble shepherd boy. The one who said, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want," is the man we just read about, who fell into sin. He went on and he wrote a psalm that is based on this experience. As you know, it's Psalm 51. It's David's confession. Now, we're going to read and we're going to find out that God forgave David. And God can forgive you, but here's the thing. We still bear the consequences of our sin. The Bible says, be sure your sin will find you out. And a familiar sermon from Billy Graham many years ago said, it'll find you out first in your conscience, then it'll find you out in the people around you, then it'll find you out at the judgment. Better to recognize the need to deal with it here and now, and better yet, the need to watch every unguarded hour of our life. Again, Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, surrounded by disciples, facing the horror of going to the cross to die for David's sin and my sin and your sin. And he came and found them sleeping, and he said, could you not watch 1 hour? That's all. 1 hour. Watch and pray, lest you enter into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh, this part of me, is weak.